welcome to a brand new edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. My name is Molly Gampage. Our top focus in this edition, US manufacturers and consumers now have more reason to consider solar energy with the newly passed Inflation Reduction Act, which provides tax incentives for the development of a more robust industry. And some manufacturers say the initiative is crucial to national security. VOA's Elizabeth Lee explaining why.
Besides its casinos, Las Vegas advertises more than 300 days of sunshine a year. And with that comes heat and high energy bills for residents.
In a house like ours, 2-story with a pool, it can be $800 or $900 a month.
To save more money, Jason Livingston is installing solar panels, which have become more affordable in the past decade.
Cost of solar has changed dramatically compared to the days when I started. And being in a place like this here in Las Vegas, financially it's a no-brainer.
Frank Rieger, founder of the Las Vegas solar company SolUp, is installing panels from Germany in Livingston's home. But the dominant player in the global solar industry is China. An International Energy Agency report in July found that China's expansion of solar panel production and innovation drove down manufacturing costs, and that China plays a part in more than 80% of the key stages of solar panel making. But dependence on China has created a supply chain risk. Oxen Solar is one of the few U.S. solar panel manufacturers. Its CEO, Mamoun Rashid.
If we don't have the supply chain here in the U.S., we look at it as a national security concern. If you have a renewable energy grid and it is powered by solar and the solar equipment is being deployed and you don't have the ability to supply yourself at any moment, the faucet can be turned off.
This year, the U.S. extended tariffs on solar products containing crystalline silicon from China. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, banning products including solar components from China's Xinjiang region, went into effect in June.
The U.S. doesn't care at all about facts and the truth, but rather politicizes normal economic and trade cooperation and artificially interferes in normal industrial and supply chains and division of labor, wantonly oppressing Chinese companies.
The Chinese embassy told VOA the U.S. needs to immediately stop spreading lies and stop enforcing this malicious legislation. The newly passed Inflation Reduction Act includes tax credits for manufacturers and consumers to encourage the growth of the U.S. solar industry.
You're dealing with China. It's not a free market economy. You can never out-subsidize China. So that won't be enough. You also need to stop the bleeding and enforce trade laws.
Oxen Solar prompted a Commerce Department investigation earlier this year into whether some solar panels coming to the U.S. from 4 Southeast Asian countries were actually Chinese products attempting to dodge U.S. anti-dumping tariffs. Many U.S. solar projects stopped, fearing retroactive tariffs. In response, Biden announced a 2-year tariff freeze on solar components from those countries.
It was devastating.
The Commerce Department says its findings will be applied at the end of the 2-year period. The White House aims to triple domestic solar manufacturing by 2024. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, Washington.
And joining us now with more details is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. She is in Washington, D.C. Hi, Jessica. We got some more key indicators on the state of the American economy this week with the release of the minutes on the Federal Reserve's meeting last week. How exactly is the central bank's battle against inflation going so far?
Well, they would tell you from what they wrote in the minutes that it's not been successful yet at reining in inflation. They had a rather dismal look at the progress so far of the rate hikes, and they are pledging to continue this significant trajectory of rate hikes. We've had 2 unprecedented rate hikes of 0.75%, and it looks likely that that will continue. The goal, of course, laid out in these minutes is to move interest rates now into what they call restrictive range. That means they're not just going to rein in inflation as their goal. They also want to tamp down spending, tamp down economic growth throughout the country. That is currently their intent. And so we are likely to see a consistent trajectory, as I said, of these increases in rate hikes. We are seeing that they're now estimating that they want to be above 3% on these rate hikes. Minutes show they don't believe inflation is coming down. And remember, their mandate is to keep inflation below 2% as well as to keep unemployment down, which is not an easy task at all without sending us into recession.
Right. Even though it passed, Republicans in the House of Representatives voted unanimously against the Inflation Reduction Act. And we saw Republican voters also voting unanimously to unseat their sitting Republican congresswoman in Wyoming. Why is this race so significant?
Well, this was a very closely watched race because it was the last primary election for one of the 10 Republican congresswomen and men who voted to impeach Donald Trump. And everyone in politics and political journalism has been watching this race to see if the Trump-backed candidate would unseat the incumbent Republican, who's essentially in line with the past Republican agenda, which is national security, cuts in spending. These are not the kinds of things that Donald Trump stood for when he was president or that the party stands for with him. She was also, of course, Liz Cheney is the Wyoming representative who lost her re-election bid this week by 30 points to the Trump-backed candidate Harriet Hageman. That basically represents the biggest landslide victory to unseat an incumbent in a very, very long time. She, not only was one of the 10 Republicans that voted against Donald Trump in the impeachment proceedings, but she's also the face in many ways of the January 6th committee investigation, which has revealed a lot of evidence that indicates not only did Donald Trump not accept the 2020 results of the election, he also encouraged his supporters to challenge them, which resulted in those attacks on the Capitol on January 6th. And we are still going through a real tsunami of contest and conflict within the Republican Party between those who say the election was stolen and those who say it was not. And increasingly, the voices are louder on the side of those who deny that the election was fair in 2020, which is a huge existential crisis for American politics.
Right. Stay on with me, Jessica. Let's move on for now to our other key focus in this edition. China continues a second round of provocative military exercises around Taiwan after the second U.S. congressional visit to the island that Beijing claims as its own. VOA's Bill Gallo sat down with Taiwan's foreign minister for an exclusive interview. Take a look.
If we talk about the status quo, especially the medium line of the Taiwan Strait, it's been there for decades, safeguarding peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and it's a high symbol of the status quo. And the Chinese government, beginning from last year, saying that there's no such thing as the medium line of the Taiwan Strait, and their Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that the whole Taiwan Strait is China's sovereignty, and they have sovereign rights to it. And they do not want the international flights or transportations to go through the Taiwan Strait. And this is a clear sign of China wrecking the status quo and the peace and stability in this area. And I think the Taiwanese people also observe that. They understand that China is becoming very provocative and very reckless in terms of its military aggression against Taiwan.
I wanted to ask you about the white paper that China released earlier this week. As many observers noted, it sort of degraded the amount of autonomy that they envision for Taiwan.
About that white paper, it reiterates lots of statements or principles that the Taiwanese people have no interest in. For example, the one country, two system model. There might be some people still have the fantasy that if there's going to be a unification, one country, two system model might not be too bad. But that kind of idea has been destroyed, totally destroyed, by the way the Chinese government is treating Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be one of the freest societies in East Asia. But with the imposition of the national security law, there's not a piece of freedom left for the Hong Kong people. And the people here in Taiwan watched it and know it. and know that that is something that we don't want to accept. So that white paper pointed out that the one country, two system model is for Taiwan. And the Taiwanese people, I would say that they don't even bother to react to that because it's so ridiculous. It ignores the basic facts.
What would you like to see sort of broadly from U.S. policy moving forward on the Taiwan issue?
If you look at the Indian Ocean or far beyond, you can see that China is much more ambitious than just the Pacific. They have built the string of pearls along the Indian Ocean. They built military bases. They wanted to buy some ports of the countries, and they come all the way to the Horn of Africa and build a military base in Djibouti. And their influence in Africa is unprecedented, far more than Europeans or the United States or Japan combined. And if you look at the political trend in Latin America, I personally also worry very much. The leftist trend of politics in Latin America is going to provide an opportunity for China to exercise its influence in this region. So if you put all this together, China has a global ambition to expand its power of authoritarianism. And looking at this situation, I think the answer is very clear. It's that all democracies need to work together to find common measures to deal with this. After all, freedom and democracy is what we treasure. We cannot allow authoritarianism to destroy what we believed.
And going back across now to VOA correspondent Jessica Stone, who is live in Washington, D.C. Jessica, China's ambassador to the U.S. Gave a long briefing with reporters this week. He says Washington is to blame for the increase in tensions between the two sides. What is the view in Washington?
Well, it's really remarkable. One of the Washington Post columnists put it like this, you know, if you really challenge black and white in America, there's enough sources of information for them to understand that what you're saying simply isn't true. And so that this Chinese charm offensive in Washington is really falling flat on its face. Reporters challenged the Chinese ambassador during that briefing, and he really didn't have a lot of points in return besides the talking points of the Chinese government, which is, you know, that Taiwan is a part of China and it will be reunited at some point under the guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. And in the meantime, the U.S. government is signaling it is going to strongly continue to back Taiwan. We just got this announcement this week about improved and increased trade talks for some sort of trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan. They began those talks this week. A State Department spokesperson calling Beijing's reaction not only to Nancy Pelosi's visit, but those congressional visits, an overreaction to what they deem simply a congressional visit. And the White House coordinator on Indo-Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell, did an unusual briefing. He doesn't usually talk to the media, but given the tensions between the U.S. and China, he gave a briefing late last week saying, we will continue to support Taiwan in the months ahead. We will continue to work with our G7 partners to show support for Taiwan. We will continue to have military exercises with South Korea and Japan and others in the region. You know, those South Korea exercises are starting in the next few days. And Campbell also said he was going to try to reestablish the diplomatic and mill-to-mill communication channels that had been ended by Beijing after the Pelosi visit. He also said that freedom of navigation patrols, which I know are very common throughout the Indo-Pacific, are going to continue in the short term in the Taiwan Strait itself. Molly?
And we have seen reports that aides to the Chinese President Xi Jinping are planning an in-person meeting with President Joe Biden in Indonesia on the sidelines of the G20. What is the latest that you're gathering on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because we really at this point still, despite that Wall Street Journal report earlier this week, have no verification from either capital that this in-person meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden will in fact take place on the sidelines of the G20. That report basically indicated that Chinese officials are making arrangements to do so. And the way U.S. officials put that into context is they say, look, we had this conversation in the last couple of weeks. Both leaders agreed to work on planning a face-to-face visit. However, they asked their staffs to make those arrangements. So they are not guaranteeing that visit will take place. And in fact, in the Chinese reaction to the invite to come to the G20 in Bali, Indonesia, they simply said they were very grateful for the invitation. They did not guarantee that Xi Jinping will be in Indonesia for those G20 meetings. So it's unclear at this point whether that will take place. But there is some thinking here in Washington that a face-to-face meeting could go a long way to reducing what are very high tensions between the U.S. and China, which of course has implications for the rest of the world.
Indeed. Jessica Stone, we are leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production.